Good morning, everybody. I'm from Datalogics, but I'm also involved in the PDF Association as the RichMedia Technical Working Group Chair. And it's a fairly new technical working group that was started about a year ago. And basically, Phil Spryer was looking for somebody to help start up this group as part of the transition from the 3D PDF Consortium into the PDF Association. And so when we first started, I thought that it'd be very focused on 3D content. And then the first few meetings, it turns out there were a lot of people that wanted to use RichMedia for audio video. And so been also looking at audio video quite a bit and trying to figure out where exactly the breakdown for how exactly these should work in the ecosystem that's where it currently works and where it could possibly work better. So I'm basically going to talk to you about why have videos in PDFs and the whole reason for why you might want to and go beyond what's currently supported now, and then the why and how you might be able to do that to add more functionality, because I think you do need new features to get people to do new iterations of viewers that support this stuff. If you get new iterations of the viewer type stuff, then you can get better support for authoring and more use for it. So it's sort of a chicken and egg type sort of thing where you need to have an idea of how to go from that. So let's see. In terms of why exactly you might want to have video in PDFs, it's because you basically have video everywhere. Not even just the consumption side where you've got your YouTube, your Netflix, your Hulu, your TikTok, and all that sort of thing. That's just on the consumption side. But even beyond that, if you look at your own personal lives, what devices you're surrounded by, you've got your webcams, your security cameras, your doorbells, your helmet cams, your dash cams. There's also sorts of things, and there's probably other stuff beyond what's shown on the screen. For example, your plumber might have a camera for looking at stuff, and most of the time, there's just so much glut of video that you don't really want to save it, but there are other cases where you do want to be able to save it. And how do you choose between the two? And how do you want to save it? Okay. So goes back to the question is why have videos in PDFs? Well, PDFs can provide context for videos. Just to give you an example, if you go to a movie theater, you don't just go see the movie without passing anything. You'll pass by movie posters that maybe have an image that basically gives you the essence of the movie and a whole bunch of text that might entice you to see the movie, like the people who are starring in it, the people who created it, the people who distributed it. And then once you go into the theater, you are seeing, on the screen, you're going to see previews where they take a 90-minute or 3-hour movie and they reduce it down to a 60-second clip of differences, what exactly are the highlights of the movie to entice you to come to these other movies. That's context. If you go to YouTube and there's a little bit of a blurb about the video before you watch it, or even a little screen capture, that's context. And you capture all that, you can capture all that in videos in a way that you can't just in the pure video formats. PDF can give you a space to put all that context in addition with the video to lump it all together. And that's one reason to have videos in PDFs. Another thing is video formats evolve, but you want to have things that are for the long term. You want to be able to not just capture the things that are coming out from your devices today, but you want them to be able to see them maybe generations from now. You have family videos that you want to see. And I think you possibly need to figure out the standards for that, for how exactly do you capture those videos for the long term. And I don't think we really have a standard for that because PDFA basically excludes that at this point, but I think that's something that should be addressed and need to figure out. The other reason that I came up with for what you might want to have videos inside of a PDF is that you want to basically take these video assets and you may want to mix up in some way that doesn't necessarily destroy the original source. You don't want to create something completely new, possibly because you don't have the tools, but you just want to put them together and you want to do some very simple editing of maybe show one video or two videos at the same time, because maybe there are two security cameras that are showing the same thing but from a different perspective, and you want to be able to show them happening simultaneously. Or maybe you have some video clip that you want to be able to play and have maybe a voiceover. Maybe it didn't have audio to go with it, but maybe it did, and you want to play it just without the audio and have other audio that you play at the same time. And right now, you don't really have a way to do that in any other formats without basically recreating everything. But if you have them in a PDF, you can basically put in a configuration that says that you could do it that way, or at least that's the idea of what I think we could possibly work towards. So one thing about video archival is that right now the PDF spec is written, so basically if you have any video format, in theory you should be able to put it into a PDF and maybe you expect it to work, but it doesn't actually work that way because we don't have like a basis of this is the basic minimum of what you need to support. You can basically put anything into it and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But I think you should be able to have some sort of basis that this is what you'll need for the future, this is what we'll support, and build off of that rather than try and come with all comers. And the basics, there is ISO standards for video formats that you could embed into it, so you could make it for archival purposes, base it on something that is already a standard, and maybe because it is standard, you'll be able to have it for future generations that if all the current software that's being used suddenly stopped working and is no longer available, you could start from the standards and rebuild software to be able to view it many generations from now. And thirdly, one thing about having PDF for video archival, you might also want to have digital signatures for provenance purposes so that you know that this actually came from this particular source. It has not been modified. It hasn't been deep-faked or anything before it was released into the wild and stuff like that. You want to be able to say that you trust this particular video and that you can still access it. You might necessarily, you don't want to change it so that, because once you start changing it, it could have been deepfaked, and you don't necessarily, you can't really tell of reality at that point with the video. So you want to be able to validate that you have your original source video, that you know that this is equivalent to the source video, and you might have done some edits for display purposes, but the original content is still there and you can still access it. I want to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about the evolution of audio and video and PDF. Is that we've basically gone through 4 different generations of trying to have videos inside of PDFs. The first one happened around 95, where the sound movie annotation were basically introduced, and you could basically do a little bit of clipping, but it's basically doing it for one particular video or audio clip. And that's been deprecated and nobody really supports it at this point. You have the second generation with the screen annotation that came in 2003, and it's technically still alive, but I'm not sure how well supported it is. Third generation is flash-based RichMedia, which came out in roughly around 2008, 2009, and it was not embraced by the PDF community because it required Adobe's proprietary flash media. However, 3D RichMedia gained a foothold. So RichMedia will continue to live because of the 3D aspect, but we also don't want to necessarily neglect the audio and video promise of the RichMedia thing. And then in 2017, we came out with PDF 2.0, which is basically kept RichMedia as it was originally conceived, but without Flash, which is, well, that's the current state of where we're at. And because you don't have this Flash structure that you can use to play videos. Still trying to figure out how to make that work too well. Basically, supporting it, if you look at these different generations, supporting it, why you had this evolution, if you think about it, first generation was probably built into the viewer, and it's very difficult to maintain all the different video formats that you want to be able to embed into a PDF inside the PDF. You basically have to do a whole lot of support to do that. Very difficult to maintain, so they switched to something else. The screens annotation, where they redid the system so they could outsource the displaying of the videos to the OS and third-party libraries like QuickTime, if you remember that. Again, that proved to be difficult to use and maintain, particularly, I think, across platforms rather than any one particular platform. But PDF is a cross-platform document, so it just made things difficult. So Generation 3, instead of outsourcing it to the OS or the third-party libraries, you outsource it to a proprietary VM that takes care of all of that, but that did not age well, and the Flash was retired by Adobe, and it's no longer available. And so we're left with an interesting content structure, but it's lobotomized in terms of how you control what goes into the PDF. So why start from the PDF 2.0 RichMedia? Basically because it does have an interesting structure that you can store multiple assets and configurations that can be shared across a number of iterations so that you can reuse the content in different ways in your document. It provides an asset name tree and an array of asset instances, basically. The asset name tree is interesting, but it's basically usable in the 3D side of things, and you basically need 3D, well, you need JavaScript to be able to access the asset tree and at this point, and which basically means you want to move away from having stuff declarative rather than using programming. So I think it's best to avoid the asset name tree. But having the array of asset instances means that you could possibly use more than one audio-video asset at a time. So you could potentially, at least in theory, looking at just a structure inside the spec, can construct a sequence of scenes that you go from one video asset to the next, and or that. But that's only one particular case of how you do it. One particular case of how you can have more than one asset in a PDF. You could also try and do a split screen where you have sequences, video sequences in parallel, or you want to have audio and video coming from different instances playing in parallel. So going from linear to parallel, it's a small conceptual jump, but you have to have the right construct for basically being able to control these, and that's what I basically want to suggest we can do. Basically, my inspiration for how exactly you might want to do this is if you have an orchestra where you have multiple instruments that are playing at the same time. They need to be synchronized, and so you basically have a conductor that's synchronizing all of these different assets. We're basically musicians where they all have their own part to play, but this conductor is basically giving them cues as to when exactly to start, when exactly to stop, or when to come in, and that sort of stuff. So that's the inspiration of what exactly the control structure inside of a PDF should be when you have multiple assets that are that you might possibly want to play at the same time. And once I had this introduction, once I had this idea of I want to be able to synchronize these different assets to play them at the same time, I went looking at the PDF spec of what exactly are PDF concepts that you could use for this configuration. And there's basically 3 areas of the PDF spec that I went to that I basically stole ideas from to that could possibly be used in a way to create this sort of structure for synchronizing multiple assets. Rendition operations, PDF functions, and affine transformations. Rendition operations basically is from the screen annotation type thing, and they're basically just tokens that basically represent different things that you might want to do with a video or an audio asset. And it basically comes down to basically the cassette tape type operations that you might want to do: play, stop, pause, resume, JavaScript in the case of screen annotations. But I think you could also take it beyond that particular case and add a few other operations, like a no-op, that if you have multiple assets and there's one or two that are doing something, you don't necessarily want to change anything of what they're doing, so don't specify anything, but just assume that they'll keep on doing it. But you could also do, like, maybe play audio only, or maybe resume video only if you've paused it. Could you do something that mutes your, or could you have something where you specify that you play once and then when you come to the end, you loop? That could be a rendition operation that you might want to be able to implement. It might not necessarily be all that difficult to say once you come to the last frame of the video, you go back to the first frame and then you continue. But right now in the screen annotation, there's no way to specify that per se without resorting to JavaScript. And for security reasons, you basically want to avoid JavaScript. Second area I want to look at is PDF functions. And PDF functions are basically used for basically rendering for the most part. But it's basically, the idea is that you can specify a certain number of inputs and you get a certain number of outputs, and there's basically things in between. Like the two function types that basically gravitated towards are the type 2 functions of interpolation. You start from one thing and you go to another thing else, and if you need a number that's between that range, then you interpolate what the value should be. And then there's type 3 functions, which basically you might have these different functions that you want to group together so that the behavior changes at a certain point. You just basically take one and take two, you split your function into two or more and put them back together. And to give sort of an idea of that, I basically tried to put this together. This is a completely valid PDF function, and basically if you had a number like, say, 119 or whatever, you would basically go through and your input would be 119. You'd look at your bounds array in the beginning to see, is it less or equal than 60? If not, then you go to 120. And if it's less than equal than 120, sure, then you look at how you encode your function and you figure out which function to use to go to. You start from the type 3 function and basically figure out which function you need to choose based on where exactly it lands on the type thing. So 119, you ended up with function in basically reference 12. Reference 12 is you basically want to go from domain of 0 to 1, and if you're at 119, you're almost at like 95% of the way through the range of that particular function, and then you basically interpolate from the beginning, which is one of the arrays at the bottom, the array number 22. You basically iterate from, well, because we're iterating from the same values from 0 to 0, is basically you're going to iterate to the value that's in that array without doing something. So if the input value, well, if the output values are starting from 4100 and the range from 4100 to 4100, at any point within that range, you're going to get 4100. I'm screwing up this explanation a little bit. But basically, what I'm trying to do with this function is you have a range of time, And in that range of time, you're going to do different things. For the first 60 seconds, what you're going to do is you're going to start playing the first video clip in your instance array, and then you're basically going to do that for 60 seconds. Then at the 60-second mark, you're going to stop playing the first clip, and then you're going to switch to the second clip. And then for the next 60 seconds, you're going to stop the second clip, and then you're going to start playing the third clip, and so forth. And so basically by having these time intervals, you can have basically different things that you can do during this certain instance of time. They can be doing different things. And then at a certain boundary, you want to switch to doing something slightly different with them. And then you can create these boundaries of where exactly you change what exactly you're going to do with these instances of video. So you could potentially have two videos that are playing simultaneously in the middle of your, basically your strength of, it's basically, instead of just doing things in a linear sense, you could basically be synchronizing things in parallel, so you can have different things going on at the same time, not just playing one video or one audio thing at a time. You can do things, have things go in sequence. The other aspect of this is that if you have two images that you want to play at the same time, you can't play them both on the same screen, that they both take the entire screen at the same time. You need a way to position them so that they might be maybe split screen, they're right next to each other, or maybe you have them tiled so that one is, or you might have four that are possibly playing at the same time. You might have one that's larger, and you might have a small one that's in the corner. These are all things that you can actually do in PDFs with images, but you use matrices to scale or rotate them or to mirror them, to put them into position. You basically use a matrix of 6 elements that basically stand in for a 3x3 matrix that basically allows you to position images how you want them on a page. And you can basically use the same concept to take frames from a video source and put them on a new frame of a video source so that you can basically combine your videos onto one frame, and that you're basically creating miniature pages that are going to be played maybe 24, 30, or 60 frames per second, however is reasonable for the application or what's feasible on the machine. Basically creating new content from the sources that you're pulling from the PDF is the idea. And because you can specify where exactly they land on the page, you can make things share even though they're coming from different things. Now, if you combine the idea of the interpolation function with the idea of the matrix, you can interpolate from one matrix to go to another matrix. And that's basically fairly close to in-betweening when you do video animation, that you basically draw something. You start off with one video cell, and then you go to another one, and you basically interpolate how exactly one transforms into the other without necessarily giving all the detail, without having to necessarily draw it. You basically calculate how exactly it changes from one to the other. If you're going from moving you start video on one side and you want to move it to the other, you only need to change the TX from a value from one to another. If you want to make things bigger or smaller over time, you can do that with interpolation. And by basically saying that by specifying these sorts of values in with your RichMedia instance, you could potentially say that you're change how exactly the video is displayed on your screen as a function of time. Boop, boop, boop. So basically, you combine all this, you end up being able to do a little bit of non-destructive audio-video editing where you don't necessarily need to use PDF functions to do that, or if you take the constructs, but having the basically, if you have configuration variables that you can put into a PDF and keep a very compact way of doing things that basically tell the viewer how exactly you want to interpret the things, you can basically get a little bit of being able to do non-destructive editing. Okay. And the connection to RichMedia, when you put all these concepts together, is if you have a RichMedia annotation, you have RichMedia settings. And in that RichMedia settings, you have an activation, which is going to be a RichMedia configuration. Your RichMedia configuration is going to have an array of instances, and basically, your instances don't necessarily have to use the same embedded file asset. You could possibly do instances that reuse the same video asset, but they're clipping different parts of it. So you could put together something like your movie preview, where you basically highlight just the highlights of the large movie, but just little clips at a time, just put them in sequence and be able to play them. And basically, on the fly, put them together so that you create a new video based on your assets, and then you play that video. Rather than having go directly from the asset to the playing it, you basically reconfigure it so that you add more information to it and create it. And it might seem as if there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to basically create a video on the fly, but being able to play a video on the fly is something that's being able to do for about 20-some decades. And if our machines have improved in speed and performance on there, could we possibly take at least a few instances and basically combine them together so that you do create something to play on the fly rather than just strictly the assets as they exist and are immovable. My inspiration for this particular graphic was basically something from that I saw on the FFmpeg wiki, basically showing how exactly they have one of their tools to basically create a mosaic of four different video assets to create a new movie. And basically for that particular thing, they're basically taking them from different files, but you can, in this particular case, you don't necessarily have them to be separate files. You could embed them all into a PDF and then sort of achieve the same sort of thing and being able to play for this. I think the takeaway from that is, well, actually, I'm not quite ready for takeaways, but basically, I think you can make a few small changes to RichMedia in order to be able to provide the ability to create videos on the fly based on source that you're not going to be editing in any way. And you should be able to implement that with current technologies after at least 2 decades of evolution, where it wouldn't necessarily be as much of a headache as it was that Adobe struggled with back in the 90s and the early aughts to make things work. I think it's possible that we can go back and implement things relatively easily, but it'll need a little bit of help. So the takeaway for doing all of this is because you do want to have contacts with PDFs, you do want to be able to archive them for the future, and you want to be able to not just dump them into the PDF and just have them sit there for playback, but you want to be able to edit it so that they don't necessarily have to watch all the video. They want to be able to put it in a way that you can do a little bit of authorship, like compare and contrast. I think for archival support, you needed to have at least one standardized format, fully configurable without scripting. And you can capture a lot of non-destructive AV editing using a fairly minimal set of time-based stitching and interpolating functions, and combine it with a slightly richer set of rendition operations. I think it's something that could happen. But the next steps for this is basically proof of concept to see, can you put this all together, not just in the structure of the file, can you then go to the implementation detail? Can you do proof of concept implementation using areas like FFmpeg and their libva type thing and make this work? Can you pull it out of the PDF, put it together, and have it give any sort of performance? And that's basically where I think the AV aspect of RichMedia is going to be in the next year or so, is can we make this work? Can we make proof of concept so that we can prove that it can work before we try and ask the viewer people that, hey, we know that this can work because we've sort of implemented proof of concepts. We want you to implement something like this. This is how we did it. Can you do something in your viewer so that we can have this ecosystem that actually supports this, not just in one viewer that's sort of reference for everybody else, but can you do it so that we can have it throughout the spectrum of everybody who does have a viewer, so that people can rely on it for their archival and context. So thank you. And do have one more thing to mention. For the 3D side of RichMedia, we do have some exciting developments with the PRC spec is being updated, the Step 242 is being updated, and Step 42 is being added as a format that RichMedia is going to be supporting, and same with GLTF. And one of the things that might be interesting with all these different 3D formats being integrated into RichMedia is, can you do something like WebGL Doom, where basically you have a 3D model that you walk through and play games into? Can you implement that in thing? And I've run out of time, so thank you. And this is basically the very first movie that was ever created. And it's people leaving for a factory. And a lot of these early movies have actually been lost because we didn't have archival support for them. They became celluloid. The celluloid burned, and we've lost them forever, except for a few well-known exceptions. But I think because of that, we do need archival support for videos long-term, not just tied to a physical product like celluloid. Thank you.